Welcome to Thriller Vault. Tonight I have a creepy thriller about two middle school best friends. Through a sticky situation, one of them realizes the other isn't quite right. This is My Best Friend, the Sociopath. When I was in middle school, I had this Spanish teacher named Senora Vergara. She was a middle-aged woman with a thick midsection and Freddy Krueger-like nails. Despite her heavy makeup, she had a face only a mother could love. My best friend Glenn and I would often joke that she was so mean because nobody wanted to marry her. Of course, we never made fun of her to her face. Glenn was a straight-A student, the smartest kid in school. He could have easily skipped 2 grades, but his parents were worried about him being bullied and being behind socially. After all, I was Glenn's only friend. Despite Glenn's intelligence, there was one subject he wasn't good at: Spanish. Senora Vergara often belittled Glenn's terrible Spanish accent. Quiero ir al baño. Quiero ir al baño, she laughed. Eres un gringo estúpido. I wasn't very good at Spanish either. To Senora Vergara, I was a gringo estupido too. She gave Glenn a D on his first quarter report card, and he had a meltdown. He'd never gotten anything but A's since we started receiving letter grades. I'd never seen Glenn so angry. He vowed to have his revenge, but I thought it was just talk. Then, the next day at school, which was a Friday, he showed me some candy that he had in his pocket. They were wrapped in shiny silver plastic without a candy logo. "What are those?" I asked. Glenn grinned and replied, "Trick candy. Makes your mouth blue. I'm going to give it to Senora Vergara." "You could get in big trouble." "I don't care." In Spanish class, Senora Vergara was her usual charming self, yelling at us and telling us to "cállate la boca," which meant to shut our mouths. While we were working on our Spanish vocabulary words, Glenn raised his hand with a glint in his eyes. I shook my head at him and mouthed, "Don't do it." Senora Vergara approached Glenn's desk and said, "¿Qué quieres?" which meant, "What do you want?" Glenn held out 4 pieces of silver-wrapped candy and said in his terrible Spanish, "Tengo el regalo para tú." Senora Vergara shook her head and corrected his Spanish. "No, tengo un regalo para ti." Glenn tried again. "Tengo un regalo para ti." To my surprise, Senora Vergara took the trick candy from Glenn and said, "Gracias." Glenn couldn't contain himself. He cracked a crooked smile. The senora stared at the candy in her hands, then stared at Glenn, who was still struggling to contain his glee. Senora Vergara's face scrunched into a scowl. She grabbed Glenn by the elbow and said in perfect English, "Come with me." The whole class was speechless as Senora Vergara practically dragged Glenn from the classroom. Everyone talked about Glenn while they were gone, trying to figure out what was happening to him. I didn't say anything about the trick candy. We were left without a teacher for a really long time, at least 10 minutes. As soon as the classroom door opened, the chatter stopped. Glenn entered the classroom with tear-streaked cheeks and red eyes, his head bowed and his mouth sealed shut. He sat in his seat and wiped his tears, staring at his desktop. A few of our classmates laughed and pointed at him. We were 7th graders. We were 12 years old, much too old to be crying in school. Glenn was a zombie for the rest of the day. He didn't say a word. He didn't even eat his lunch. After school, I walked home with Glenn like I usually did. My mom had died of cancer a few years ago, and my dad didn't keep many snacks in our house, so I always went with Glenn to his house for a few hours after school for sugary treats and the latest video games. On the walk to Glenn's, I asked him for the 7th time that day, "What happened?" Glenn shook his head and answered for the first time. He said, "I'm going to get her back. You watch." When he spoke, I noticed his teeth were bright blue. "She made you eat the candy?" Glenn nodded, his head hanging as we walked. "That wasn't the worst part." I waited for him to elaborate, but he was silent, so I asked, "What was the worst part?" "She took me to this closet with a bunch of foreign language textbooks." Glenn swallowed hard. "She grabbed me by my upper arms and shook me. Her nails were digging into my arms." Glenn stopped on the roadside, faced me, and pulled up his sleeve, exposing 5 angry red welts. What a bitch, I said. She made me tell her about the trick candy, then she... Tears welled in Glenn's eyes. Then she what? I asked. Glenn wiped his eyes and said, She made me eat all the candies, and she called me names in Spanish. Like what? Chico, Gordo. Glenn sniffled. I might suck at Spanish, but I know that means fat boy. This was a sore spot for Glenn. He'd been overweight his entire life. I patted Glenn on the back. Don't worry about it, bro. You can always lose weight, but she'll always be an ugly-ass bitch. Glenn smiled. Thanks, Mo. As we continued walking through Glenn's uppity neighborhood, he said, I got an idea. Do you think you can stay over tonight? Probably. Why? We could sneak out and go to her house, toilet paper it, or throw eggs or something. I don't know, bro. My dad would kill me. Glenn stopped again and faced me. Come on, Mo. After what she did to me, I have to get her back. I shook my head. Please, Mo, I need your help. I took a breath and said, Okay. Glenn grinned from ear to ear. In addition to Glenn being the smartest kid in middle school, he was also a computer genius. He easily found Esmeralda Vergara's address with an internet background check that cost $9.99. It was only a few miles away. We could easily make it on bikes. That Friday night, we stayed up late playing World of Warcraft. Glenn was the master at video games, but he liked to play on the same team as me. He didn't like to kill me, even though he could. At around 10, we snuck out of Glenn's parents' McMansion, but I'm not sure we needed to. Glenn's parents didn't pay much attention to him. For the most part, we were left to our own devices. We had stashed our bikes behind the house, so we wouldn't have to go in the garage. Technically, they were both Glenn's bikes, his brand new ultra-expensive mountain bike and a slightly older but also expensive mountain bike. They were gifts from his parents, no doubt hoping he'd get some exercise, but Glenn rarely used the bikes. We stayed off the highway, using the side streets and the GPS on Glenn's bike to lead us to Senora Vergara's house. We stashed the bikes in the woods across the street from her house. From the safety and concealment of the woods, we inspected her house. Glenn peered through his binoculars, but we were close enough to see that the Senora's house was a little one-story red brick house. I recognized her red Honda in the driveway. I knew it was hers because I'd seen her getting out of it at school before, and it had a little Panama flag bumper sticker. She was rarely in a good mood, but when she was, she talked about growing up in Panama and how she was related to some famous Panamanian boxer. She called him Stonehands or something like that. But her red Honda wasn't the only car in the driveway. There was a black Cadillac there, too. We both recognized that car. Glenn lowered his binoculars. He raised one side of his mouth in a smirk and said what I was thinking. I think that's Principal Carlson's car. Lots of people drove black Cadillacs, but I nodded and said, Probably. What's he doing here this late? Glenn sucked in a sharp breath and answered his own question. Oh, shit! He's having an affair! I scrunched my face. With Senora Vergara? She looks like a troll. Glenn laughed. I had seen the family picture on Principal Carlson's desk. So had Glenn. It was an old picture back when Principal Carlson was slim and had hair. His kids were probably grown and working on their own families. I had wondered why the pictures were facing out. Didn't he want to look at his wife and 2 kids? Glenn and I had been in Principal Carlson's office 6 weeks ago, the 4th day of school. This big 8th grader purposely bumped into Glenn in the hall and made him fall. Everyone was laughing, so I pushed the guy back, and he knocked into someone else and fell down. I'm pretty big for my age, too, and I have muscles. I lift my dad's weights in our garage. A teacher had come out of her classroom just as I pushed this kid, so I had to go to the principal's office. But Glenn told the teacher that I was sticking up for him, so we both went to explain our side of what had happened. But that 8th grade kid slipped away in the crowd, although everyone knew who he was, so he got into trouble too. I got in-school suspension, but I didn't get in trouble at home. My dad's strict, but not about fighting, as long as I didn't start it. Maybe he's friends with her, I said, in reference to likely Principal Carlson's Cadillac. Maybe his wife's there too. They could be having dinner or something. Glenn shook his head. No way. Not this late. I removed my backpack and unzipped the main pocket. exposing the toilet paper we'd taken from Glenn's house. We should do the toilet paper before the eggs. The eggs will make noise. I got a better idea. Glenn removed his cell phone from his pocket and crept toward the house. I hurried after him. What are you doing? I asked in a hushed whisper. You'll see. As we neared the driveway, I spotted a Jefferson Middle School bumper sticker on the Cadillac, confirming that it was Principal Carlson's car. Most of the windows of the red brick Rambler were lit. I followed Glenn as he crept around the house, peeking into the windows. What are you doing? I asked again. You'll see. The television flickered in the living room, but nobody watched it. We crept around the house, finding what was likely the master bedroom. The curtains were drawn, but they didn't quite meet together, leaving an open sliver. Glenn peeked between the curtains and whispered, "Oh, shit!" "What is it?" I whispered, squatting below the window. But Glenn didn't answer. He fumbled with his phone, readying his camera. He took pictures through the window. "You gotta see this." I stood and peered over Glenn's shoulder, but I wish I hadn't. I saw Principal Carlson and Senora Vergara, together, totally naked, loose skin and fat jiggling everywhere, grunting and groaning. It was gross, and it's an image that was burned into my memory forever. It'll probably be the last thing I remember before I die. Then, Principal Carlson turned his head, and I swear he looked right at us. Glenn and I ducked under the window, and we ran back to the woods. We hid there, watching the house, listening to our heavy breaths and the crickets chirping. Carlson exited the front door, shining a flashlight and wearing a robe. He walked around the house in pink slippers. Then, he returned to the front door and illuminated the front yard with his flashlight. He must have seen our footprints in the grass, as he followed them with the flashlight beam, eventually illuminating the woods. Glenn and I lay flat, our heads down. Thankfully, our bikes were well hidden. Principal Carlson went back inside. We waited until the coast was clear, then we hightailed it back to Glenn's house. Glenn was all excited, talking about how he was going to ruin Senora Vergara's life, and if Principal Carlson didn't do what he wanted, he would ruin his life too. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Blackmail," Glenn replied. I tried to talk Glenn out of it, but he was adamant. He printed out the best pictures on his laser printer and made several copies. It was undoubtedly Senora Vergara and Principal Carlson. He cackled as he typed the letter that said, "Dear Principal Carlson, you've been a bad boy. You are supposed to be a shining example to your students, but you are a liar and a cheat. If Esmeralda Vergara isn't fired by October 21st, then I will make sure your wife sees what you did. A concerned citizen." On Saturday, I begged him not to send the letter with the picture. I said, "Don't do this. Principal Carlson might have seen us." Glenn shook his head. "I don't care if he saw us. What's he going to do? With these pictures, I have the power." I thought I was going to throw up when I watched him drop the large envelope into the big blue mailbox. It was done. There was no going back now. He had sent the letter to Carlson at school. I wondered if Principal Carlson opened his own mail. For his sake, I hoped he did. I went home on Saturday, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw and what we did. I kept wondering if Principal Carlson saw us, and if he did, what would he do to us? I was sick to my stomach. I tried to get out of school on Monday, but my dad wasn't having it. He said, "It's best you learn to deal with discomfort." Glenn seemed perfectly normal at school, happy even, but I was a mess. But nothing happened on that Monday. Nothing happened on Tuesday either. I started to relax, thinking that maybe it would all blow over. But then on Wednesday, Glenn and I were called to the office. We sat in the waiting area of the office. I was sweating bullets, my hands jittery. Glenn whispered, "Don't say anything. I'll handle it." I couldn't understand how he could be so calm. We were escorted to the principal's office by one of the office ladies. She shut the door behind us. Principal Carlson glared at us from behind his desk. The big brown envelope that Glenn had sent to Carlson sat on his desk, opened at one end. He gestured to the wooden chairs in front of his desk. "Sit down." We did as we were told. Principal Carlson sat behind his desk and steepled his fingers. "What am I going to do with you two?" He paused for a moment, waiting for a response that never came. I could call the police, have you both arrested for stalking, peeping, and pornography. You would go to juvenile detention for years. I have seen sentences as long as 10 years for what you two did. You would end up in adult prison. Do you know what happens to young men in adult prisons? They're raped, Glenn said, matter-of-factly. I looked at Glenn with wide eyes. That's right, Principal Carlson replied. So I'll give you a choice. If you give me all the pictures you have, and I'd like to see the originals erased from your camera, then I'll consider letting you two off with a serious warning. I breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that Carlson was giving us a reprieve. I don't think so, Glenn replied. I gave Glenn a "what the hell are you doing" look. Would you rather go to prison? Carlson asked. You won't call the police, and if you do, you have no proof of anything. Mo and I will deny everything. Without our confession, you have nothing. Principal Carlson reddened. Where is this coming from, Glenn? You're a good student. I don't understand what has gotten into you. This isn't about you, Glenn replied. This is about Vergara. She's a nasty person and a terrible teacher. She has to go. If you don't fire her by the end of the week, you know what will happen. Glenn stood from his chair. Let's go, Mo. Where do you think you're going? Carlson asked, also standing. Back to class. There's nothing left to talk about. I followed Glenn out of the principal's office. By Friday, Senora Vergara was gone, never to be heard from again. Glenn went on like nothing had happened, except he was happy with the Spanish sub, who was much nicer than Vergara, and he got A's in Spanish for the rest of the year. You would think that everything went back to normal, but Glenn and I were never the same. We were still best friends through middle school, but I was more cautious around him. I started playing sports, so I spent less time with him. Then, during the summer after we graduated from middle school, Glenn sent me a text of a laughing emoji with a video attached. The video showed Principal Carlson's wife wearing her robe and opening a brown envelope on her front porch. He zoomed in on her face as it morphed from curiosity to shock to agony. It was then that I knew there was something seriously wrong with Glenn. He was a cold and calculating kid who would hurt anyone to get what he wanted. I distanced myself from him, often lying and telling him that I couldn't hang out. In high school, we drifted apart. I became a football star and the most popular guy in high school, while Glenn got weirder and weirder. I saw him get beat up after school one day, but I didn't help him. Without my protection, he was bullied constantly. I tried to forget him, and for the most part, I did. Until. Thank you so much for listening and watching Thriller Vault. If you enjoyed this story, it's derived from my novel, The Interview, which is available as an ebook, print book, and audio book. I hope to see you all next week for another thriller story.